Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our weekly COVID webinar. This week, our session is New Year, New Special Education Updates. I'm Jackie Godapur-Werns, and I'm excited to welcome you today. With me are two of our Franczek COVID team members that you've come to know and trust, Dana Fattore Crumley.
Hi, everybody.
And Jennifer Smith.
Hello.
Also this week, we're pleased that our partner Kendra Yoch is joining us. Welcome, Kendra.
Thanks. Good afternoon.
And we're going to be discussing all things special education that you need to know in the new year, including, as always, COVID updates, and also some discussions about preparing for IEP season during this interesting time. Before we begin, for some light housekeeping, please submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. It is much easier for us to keep track to answer questions there than in the chat. Also, mark your calendar for next week's webinar, which will address labor hot topics. Please make sure to watch your email for registration details for next week. And as always, please submit your questions to us at covid@franczek.com. before the webinar. We do our best to integrate the questions we receive into our sessions, and thank all of you who sent in questions for today. If you have any follow-up questions or we don't get to a topic that you would like to discuss, please feel free to contact any of us or any of your other Franczek attorneys. All right, so let's jump into talking special education. So we haven't seen an uptick in due process yet. What's our impression of how disputes will develop during the second semester?
So I'll start. I think, we had this discussion sort of before we came on the webinar, and I think we are at somewhat of a breaking point. I don't know about for due process filings. I don't know that we've necessarily seen an uptick in that yet, but I do think we're at the point where everybody in special ed is dealing with a large number of parents and students that are struggling, and communicating and, conveying a sense of it's going to be okay is pretty much job one. One of the issues is that we've definitely seen, not at the due process level, but a lot of calls about is parents asking for residential placement. There's been a lot in the news about the social emotional struggles of many students. The no more athletics for some students has caused a decline in their social emotional functioning, not being able to see peers. And if you have the special ed population that's already struggling to sort of maintain their progress with, their goals and just sort of doing things generally, that's exacerbated. I also have seen some concerns about younger kids that are learning critical skills, reading instruction and RTI for reading. Kendra, what about things you've seen just in monitoring what's going on?
Yeah, in looking at the cases that we're seeing come in from across the country, it's still the main theme, and we've talked about this before, is a failure to implement IEPs. And so, that requirement to implement IEPs has remained in effect. There's not any flexibility. And that's where, creating a remote learning plan, a continuous learning plan of some sort can really help you to spell out what is it going to look like during remote learning? How is it going to be different? And give you that flexibility for the pieces that maybe aren't really workable or aren't really applicable in this new environment. So the cases we're seeing, a lot of them are, my student was supposed to get this much speech per week and it didn't happen. And so making sure that we're continuing to provide those services, number one, and number two, continuing to document them. And that's really kind of the make or break piece in the cases. The districts where they have good documentation showing, here's our related service log, here's the student's progress, those districts typically prevail. The districts that don't really have great documentation, they can't show that, yes, the student did work with a special ed teacher on this schedule, this is what happened. In those cases, we are seeing more awards of compensatory education and things along those lines. So that documentation piece is just so critical.
So thinking about it in terms of IEP season and a lot of annual reviews starting to tick up, the interesting thing now is we have the whole problem in reverse that we had in the spring, where we're in remote now. Some are in remote or some are in hybrid or whatever, but presumably within the next year, one would hope that you're back at a full in-person capacity. And so as you're doing the annual review and people, you're inclined to kind of think in terms of whatever your schedule is right now, we really kind of need to also flip back to, unless you want to redo all these IEPs again when the model change, make sure that you have the plan both for whatever the hybrid minutes are, but then also for the return to in-person, whenever that is.
And we have seen some districts, a lot of districts, building that into their IEP process now, that anytime we have a meeting, we're going to talk about what it looks like in each, different sort of modality and document that. And I think some states like California has actually gone so far as to require that now, a contingency plan is required in any IEP. And so thinking about how to build that in so you don't have to be holding multiple meetings as the circumstances change.
I mean, we've started to have discussions, and there started to be discussion, not just in our firm, but in the educational Illinois community, about whether or not remote will continue. So, I mean, that's one thing too for these kids, for the kids who remote is actually going well for. Are we going to get requests to continue remote into next year? And just being thoughtful of, right now everyone has to have remote. So it's really no skin off your teeth, so to speak, to provide that modality. You likely are, or are you required to, but that requirement may not continue. It may end as soon as this spring, the summer, who knows? So not to overpromise the duration of remote, or assume that your district will be offering remote for the whole year of whatever IEP, because I'm guessing that's not the case.
Yeah, I agree. That's a really good bit of advice, because we don't know what's going to happen to remote once we have vaccines. And I suspect that it is going to be difficult to move some people off remote. I mean, I think what we've learned is, like, remote could be a great strategy for some of our kids, whether they are medically frail, or they had an injury of some sort and they're not mobile and they can't get to school. This is going to be great for them. Like, we're going to innovate in this. But I'm also concerned that there is going to be a larger percent of our population that just does not want to come to school, because a lot of the manifestation of certain disabilities, especially ED, is just this avoidance, this not wanting to sort of engage in sort of the normal executive functioning and be excused from something. And I think it's going to be tempting to provide remote to those types of students. And maybe that's an interim solution, but to do that for a long amount of time, I think will result in denials of FAPE and claims later. So just to be careful.
Yeah.
So Dana, we have a question. Oh, sorry guys. We just had a question that was right on this topic of will remote ever be considered an LRE placement, which is an interesting question. And I mean, the way that I kind of think about it is home is on the spectrum of continuum of placement options. Under the ISB rules, that's always looked kind of, the default is minimum of 5 hours a week. We are in a totally, now remote has taken on a whole new meaning, or homebound. I mean, to just do 5 hours of contact with no structure, without any of the, planning that has gone around what remote looks like now. I think there's going to be a lot of dissatisfaction, I guess, if we just try to go back to the homebound tutor, kind of shuffling or escorting the student through some homework that they basically get from the teachers. I suspect that is not going to cut it as far as people's expectations. Legally, none of that has changed. I mean, I wonder if that's an area that when people have time to come up for a breath, even that law, you can see that really looks different from what the model of best practice remote looks like now.
Absolutely. And just just thinking about it as an LRE, it's never, I mean, it's never, it's would have to be pretty extreme to consider that to be the LRE. You know, I think that you're just not, you're not in a community in the same way. I mean, even if you had a few kids remote learning, I think the fact that it's just so you on the screen is gonna, there's got to be some implication of that when you're looking at the LRE analysis, because it really is it's not just, you know, restrictiveness, it's also interaction with others, and there's just such limited interaction with others. You know,
Yeah, I think what you said is, you know, using it as a temporary intervention could be for a kid who's really refusing to come to school at all. If you can get them on remote, you know, is better than nothing. But then that next step is, how do we then get them into the building for part of the day or for some sort of service, and kind of move beyond that, as opposed to thinking of it as, you know, just long term, this is where the student will be, except, you know, in those medical situations where it might be necessary.
On the other hand, we're, depending on the questions we get today, one topic we might talk about is residential. And this just makes me think, because usually home is more restrictive than even residential, because you don't have contact with peers or staff. But I mean, we're going to talk about, there's a lot of negative things, not necessarily laws yet, but in the press, in the some of the advocacy has really started to mount against residential placement. And even my observations, they're not scientific, but you know, I would be inclined to prefer home and remote over residential as far as outcomes, even though it is I mean, you're at least not removing the student from the community. I mean, right now it would be less preferred than residential, but I really question that as far as, I mean, removing students from communities and placing them in, you know,
basically institutionalized. I mean,
yeah, institutionalizing kids. Is that worse?
Institutional setting, and I do think that allowing for the remote should change the perspective on that a little bit. And not that it's never necessary. I think we're always going to have situations where residential placement is necessary. I know that's one of the things that I think for attorneys, I think a lot of times you'll work with newer directors and they'll be like, well, we don't do residential placements in this district. We just never do them. And that is not, that's not a legally viable position, because you just don't know what you're going, I mean, we're public schools. We don't know the needs of the students that are going to walk through our doors. And I think there are situations where for the students' health and safety, they might need that round the clock institutionalized setting. But on the other hand, someone who is just, you know, not making progress, maybe engaging in some, you know, risk behaviors, but not not completely atypical compared to what other adolescents do. It's like, you know, killing a fly with a nuclear bomb in those cases. And we have to be wary of that.
Jackie, we've gone way off topic. I don't even know how you're going to
bring us back.
Yeah, where are we?
Dana, that language is very evocative, so thank you. In a good place to switch gears. So we know that we've been seeing a lot of impacts in different areas, different legal areas. So one of them is residency with special education. So Jennifer, can you tell us generally, remind us about special education residency, and then what are we seeing as changes right now?
So yes, so Illinois law, right or wrong, it has a different test for residency for gen ed versus special ed students. And when I say right or wrong, this year has brought out the challenges in that, because what happens is, so for gen ed students, the school code says that you can complete the year. Once you establish residency, you can complete the year. So, but the special ed residency section doesn't say that, and has provisions that make it seem like when a special ed student becomes a non-resident during the year, likely the residency transfers to the new district. There's also different tests. So different times when a special ed student, for example, their residency would be based on their location versus their parents' location. And it's just a different test. So when one family with multiple students has moved out of the district this year, this has caused a lot of consternation, because what you're going to tell the family, oh, your gen ed student can continue because we're in remote, so you can easily access, but your special ed student needs to register in Florida or wherever it is you are. You know, it's just a very odd outcome of the law. However, at the same time, you know, with special ed students, especially when you look at funding, so say a student is residentially placed or is placed in a private day school, and they move out of the district and move really far out, you know, move states, move countries, it becomes very difficult for the home district in Illinois to meaningfully oversee that student's special education. It takes so much. It takes a different level of oversight. So it does make sense in some ways that the law would be different for special ed and non-special ed. Where I have some ongoing disputes that are really odd from our fact background. It's nothing that I've ever seen. I have students living out of the country. It's very difficult to determine intent to return or apply the usual kind of residency tests that we do to know whether someone's even a resident. I mean, some of the information is based on looking at their Zoom and where they are or where the student's saying they are. It's just a very odd time. But there are reasons, like I said, funding reasons, practical reasons to challenge special education students' residency right now. And Kendra and Dana, I know you've seen some of this too.
Yeah, for sure. This has become just a really big issue because people have moved or maybe haven't moved, but are temporarily staying someplace else. You know, if because of remote learning, they need additional help with childcare, they may be staying with extended family that's outside the district, maybe with friends, maybe just want to go someplace warmer, but temporarily. And I think if it's temporary, they probably still are your kid. And figuring out, is it temporary or not, you know, digging into all those facts, you know, do they still have their property in the district? Are they renting it out to somebody else? Where are they staying? How long are they staying? Trying to, you know, dig into all those facts changes the situation, and each one is a little different. And Jennifer's right, we've seen so many different variations on these fact patterns that, you know, we've never seen before. And, you know, you couldn't have seen it before because in the past, if you moved to Florida or went to Florida for a month, you can't be in school. You'd have to change. But now there is this option to remote in, which has made it much more complicated. You know, an additional factor complicating this is with related services. We've heard, you know, some concern about, is there a risk to your license if you're providing services to a student who's out of state, even temporarily? And Dana, we've talked about this a lot. Do you want to kind of chime in on this piece?
Sure. And I think this is a common concern, and I have had it from several clients. I know that there's people, certain attorneys are taking different positions on this. It's not clearly stated in any of the executive orders that you know, this can happen or can't happen. But, you know, taking all of that into consideration, I think it really turns on the fact of, you know, you have to think of it from a practical perspective too. And, you know, we're in the midst of a pandemic. There are a lot of societal problems that are going on right now, from an uptick in crime to a raise in depression to economic stresses. I am not sure that the state of Illinois is really looking at OT and PT licenses closely, I guess is my main point, is that this is not going to be like a top thing that people are doing. And I'm not saying you should ignore the law, but at the same time, I think that for these temporary kids that are temporarily going places due to the pandemic, and it really is they're going places because parents are stressed, or a parent is an essential worker, or a parent is a healthcare provider and needs to access extended family or friends to help to care for their child. To say that we're not going to do related services for a student that is planning to come back and be part of the district after this crisis is over, I just don't see how that's a good argument. But that being said, if you are in a co-op and these people won't provide services, I think, what do you do? I think you have to tell parents that the co-op has said that they're not going to provide these services. This is part of your program. We can't provide them to you while you're in Arizona or Florida with grandma, but we will, when you come back, we're going to assess where you are in terms of your goals in these areas and your needs. And we will accommodate that when you come back. And that might mean more service or changing goals or doing something when you come back. But I really hate things like that, because I do think that in a way it's a valid legal concern, but I see it more as a labor issue. I see this is a labor issue. Are people really worried about losing their license because they're doing online consultation about how to hold a pencil? Is that really the problem? Or is there something else behind it? Maybe I'm just a pessimist.
Well, I mean, and when you look at legal risks, not providing IEPs, so we would all say that student is a resident in the district. The district are obligated to implement the IEP, and you're not implementing it. And I mean, at some point, perhaps, someone's going to decide if this was a valid concern or not. I think it probably isn't. And, you've definitely violated the law by not providing the service. I think there's very little argument that you aren't violating the law by not implementing an IEP. So I don't know. And we've talked about, we can get way into the weeds if someone's dealing with this, but there is, it's not clear in the executive orders, but there are ways to read the executive orders that makes it pretty clear that no one is itching to go after these licenses, nor in all of the years of all three of our practices, I've never actually seen someone go after a license. When I've had that concern raised to me, I've never had it come to fruition in any way against any service provider when good faith was, in this situation, when the good faith of just trying to support a student is really what's going on. So it's concerning that students are being denied services for that reason.
Well, we did get a comment while we were kind of having that discussion about it, at one point being clear as mud, but then got a thank you. So I'm thinking that you guys just took mud and turned it into water for everyone, hopefully, and clarifying that point. So talking a little bit more about federal actions, we saw some action by the outgoing U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, my former employer. And so right before the Trump presidency officially ended on Inauguration Day, we saw a flurry of work from them. So Kendra, I'm hoping you can tell us what are we seeing in the area of special education from OCR?
Yeah, it was really interesting to see these come in right at the end of the Trump administration, but we saw reporting on two different proactive investigations initiated by OCR. So I know you guys are all familiar with OCR complaints when a parent files and says, the school district has discriminated against my child by not, providing them equal access, by not implementing the IEP, name your violation. And this is a little bit different. This OCR is on its own accord coming out to the district and saying, we're going to check out what's going on. We have concerns. We're going to collect all the data, interview all your people, just like it was a regular complaint. But they've initiated these, and there's one in Seattle and one in Indiana. And they both deal with the services that have been provided to special education services students during the pandemic. So in Seattle specifically, what we know about the letter is it's looking at concerns that some students were not provided any specialized instruction, and that some teachers were actually directed not to provide specialized instruction and not to make accommodations and adaptations to their lessons for students who have special needs. So that certainly would be very concerning. And I, obviously have no idea the veracity of any of those. They're just starting this investigation. The report also talks about parent concerns about the inavailability of in-person services, especially given that in some of the neighboring districts, in-person services were available to students who have IEPs, as well as delays in evaluations. And those certainly are, concerns that we hear, from parents in this area as well. The concerns in Indiana revolved around several complaints to the state that the remote services being provided were really kind of a one-size-fits-all, like this is what we're doing for remote instruction, this is what you get, as opposed to individualizing it to meet, the specific requirements of students' IEPs and their 504 plans. So again, that would certainly be a concern given all of the guidance that we've had that, those IEPs continue to be in effect, and we need to be doing that individualization. So, obviously now we have a new administration. We don't really know how they're going to handle these two investigations that were initiated right at the end of the Trump administration. It's not clear if, the plan is to continue to initiate more of these, looking for other districts that are states that may not be in compliance, or if that's not the route that they'll take, we'll have to sort of wait and see. It's also likely there are, a bunch of complaints, individual complaints that have been raised. And so we'll have to see how the new OCR team handles those. We have heard that Biden wants to increase OCR enforcement. Civil rights has been a major priority, and it's sort of just a kind of wait and see how they approach that. If it's sort of in a supportive role versus the kind of enforcement, I'm going to go find out all the people who are breaking the law during this difficult time. So we'll be watching for how that plays out, as well as the guidance that has been promised related to reopening schools, waiting to see if that's going to address some of this, all of the issues related to recovery services, to how are we supposed to deal with the increase in requests for evaluations, the increased need for mental health services, will we get funding from Congress? So many things. We're kind of just waiting to see where is it going to go.
Yeah, that case is such an interesting reminder that, in all areas of civil rights, that whether it's disability, race, color, national origin, sex, gender, whatever, that sometimes OCR doesn't wait for a complaint. They go out looking for them. So those two situations are important reminders of that.
It's probably helpful for people, and especially Jackie, you've been through this, and we've all seen it as attorneys in the field. When there's a change in OCR, it changes at the DC level, but all the same attorneys that we work with in the Chicago office, they've been the same attorneys through all the administrations. So their marching orders may change, or their procedure, the procedures they have to follow, et cetera. But the faces are the same, and the way I think that we understand their thinking generally, is they're the same people, the same professionals. So, I mean, they are directed in a different way, but I just wouldn't want to overstate on the ground, so to speak, changes that you're going to see if you have an individual case with our local office.
Well, although I think,
oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I do think these cases are sort of a cause for concern, though, because now they're out there, and they're, even though the people aren't different, it's raising issues that may not have been at the forefront, right? And I think that, and the media, and I just think the level of distress I'm hearing from special ed directors who are fielding these calls from parents, and especially when you have like sort of the lower incidence disabilities and these kids just not engaging with remote instruction, just not engaging, and schools sort of thinking, because I think this is what we typically think when kids are in school, like if I keep serving up the service and they don't take it, serving up the service and showing that I'm doing that is going to be enough to defend me if things don't work. And I don't know if that's going to be good enough. You know what I mean? Just putting up links, just putting up homework, delivering packets, that might not be considered good enough to engage with a special ed student, especially when you look at the things that could be in an IEP, including like parent training and stuff. Is you're taking this kid that was used to being with maybe a room with 4 adults in it, and you're putting them back in a home with maybe one parent supervising and then trying to do a job. You're not going to be able to show that you met the requirements of the IEP in some circumstances. So I think, it's important to sort of catch these things now, or you are going to be in a situation where, and maybe we can't capture them all now, but I would be prepared for looking at ways when they come back to meet them where they are and bolster programming so that you don't have these claims.
Don't you think, or I have a sense that if, we're not seeing some of those filed yet, but once and I think if we actually were to do a due process now, you would get more consideration from hearing officers in courts around the safety concerns. But the further we get away from those, so when we get a complaint in a year that looks back and says, was this appropriate going back? And the safety concern has passed, the hearing officer, I don't think, is going to be hesitant to light you up for compensatory services up the wazoo, or extended eligibility time past 22, or resident, private placement to try to recoup. I mean, there's a lot of things that I don't know that they would do now because the sympathy's in your corner, but this is a 2-year statute of limitations, and I think memories will be somewhat short on how dangerous on the health and safety issues.
Absolutely. I think that's such a good point. I think it's going to be so hard to defend in a year if we're all back. Yeah.
Yeah. And even if, the hearing officer is to take into account, yes, there was a safety consideration, we couldn't have a whole class in school. The question is, what did you do then? And like Dana was saying, just putting up that link for a lot of kids is not going to be sufficient. Did you have an IEP meeting to try and problem solve to figure out how can we support the student given the safety concerns? Did we think about other alternative ways to provide the services? And what's the documentation that we went through that process to think kind of outside the box for that?
Well, and I kind of hate to say it this way, but parents now are direct observers about how deficient our services are in some situations. So before, you had to get experts to come and testify that what the district was doing was deficient. But now the parent's going to be they are eyewitness. They can testify themselves. So they're going to say, I saw the teacher didn't do anything. She was on her phone. She told him to write. He couldn't even write his name, and she didn't get back to us. I mean, it's going to be terrible testimony from parents.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. They're seeing everything. Sometimes, in some cases, they're having their private providers, and people are like, well, we need, that's illegal. And I know I've had, questions from teachers. Can't we, tell parents that they can't tape us, they can't watch, there's student confidentiality. You can do all those things, but practically they have no impact. And I don't think you can tell somebody to not watch something that's going on in their own home with their own child. I mean, that's sort of going to be a stretch. And I think you try to put that out in front of a hearing officer, they're going to think you're crazy. They're going to say, you're taking all this tax money, you're providing a service. It's not that much of a confidential service that the parent can't see. So yeah, that's something to think about, and just making that just sort of reinforces, like, there's just keeping track of what people are doing and the impressions people are giving to parents, because things are going to go wrong. Things can go wrong. I mean, this is like the big medical malpractice philosophy, right? Like, things are going to go wrong, but if you can address them and say, okay, it went wrong, we're going to do plan B, and let's have a meeting to really discuss plan B, and let's write this down that we gave you a good plan B. That's a better approach than to just say, oh, we did our best. It didn't, that I think just doesn't fly and doesn't work. And I think you know, I know staff are exhausted and you get exhausted sort of doing the same thing, but you know, that's what we do. That's the growth mindset, right? You have to keep doing it. That's ultimately being a teacher, is keep trying to get people to brainstorm to get them over that hump.
And I will say, kind of to speak to both sides of this issue, there are some parents who are watching their child in remote learning and for the first time saying, oh, wow, I didn't realize how low my student was or how much they were struggling or that the teacher's not providing this. On the other side, I was in an IEP meeting recently where historically the parent has been really skeptical. The teacher reports your kid can do this and we have the support, and the speech pathologist and I collaborate and work together and we co-treat, and the parent is like, I don't believe it, I don't see it, there's no way that's happening, you're just like blowing smoke at me. And now the parent sits there all day and sees it happening and sees the teacher making a modification and sees the OT and the speech pathologist both working and how that works. And this IEP meeting was a little bit easier because I think now the parent believes like, oh, the team, they're doing what they said they were doing the whole time. So I have seen it on both sides, that there are, you know, some positive results of parents really having a better window into their educational program.
Yeah.
We got a question of clarification of whether, are you saying that private service providers are able to sit with child during remote learning legally? Is this okay?
I think that you'd have to give them observation opportunities in the way that the school code provides for observations. I'm not saying they can just clandestine, like you should try to put some controls on it. I'm not saying throw your hands in the air, but you know, providers and parents, they can observe what you're doing. You know, it's still public education and it's considered a public service, and it's, you know, if before this remote period, they could come in and there's, you know, the process for it. We encourage clients to have a process with procedure and time limit and parameters about confidentiality, but it's in the law.
Right. Usually we would say, especially if you're worried about a legal dispute, if they're observing, you should have an observer take their own notes, so that just the fact of what the private provider says happened, we have someone, because the teacher cannot both teach and observe the observer. It's too much. But again, I think, I mean, I just heard a lot of parents describe what's going on. They're just observers now to the education in a new way.
And I wonder if this question is also asking, you know, for kids who maybe are younger or do have more significant impairments, or parents who are trying to manage a lot of things and they've got a babysitter, an aide, a private provider of some sort sitting next to the student to help them with remote learning. You know, do we have legal concerns about that? And I don't know if that changes the way you guys think about that question.
You know, I think that I don't really have legal concerns about that. I guess when you have that situation though, I mean, this is another issue on our list, is what do you do then when parents says, well, they need this person, pay for it? Or, you know, when you're at school, you have a one-on-one aid for my child, you need to pay for this. So I think it opens that whole can of worms, and it's difficult, I think. And I think you've got to look at a lot of factors. I think the age of the student is a huge factor. You know, we had a recent issue with, you know, parents wanting a private provider or school districts to pay for the copay of an insurance provider. Sometimes the insurance will pay for some private therapy at home, pay the copay because this person can like then help us with remote. But again, it goes back to I think the age of the student. I think when they're young students, like you can't expect a kindergarten to remote learn without an adult in the room, even if they're, you know, the next Albert Einstein of the kindergarten class, right? Like they're so far at the top of the, you know, the curve, and they're just, and they have all the emotional intelligence of, I don't know, you know, Oprah. They're still going to need an adult to sit and be with them and monitor the learning and get them on the computer and all of that. And that's true for young children. I think the harder question is when you have these very disabled, older children that, you know, their typically developing peers could, I don't know. It's a hard question. I think you have to take each case individually.
So Dana, we've obviously been talking about this some, but can you give us any more insight on if people are getting demands for in-home private services, and we know that those have increased, what kind of advice do we have on fielding those questions?
So for me, that starts with, you have to look at your offer of FAPE. Look at your IEP plan. Is your IEP that you are providing, absent anything the parent's doing, is it providing a FAPE? Is the student going to make progress, not, you know, reasonable progress? And I think to some extent you can take the pandemic in, but don't let the pandemic be your excuse for absolutely no progress, because I don't think that will fly either. But you need to look at that program. And if you're not providing something that you think the student needs, you need to go back to the drawing board and think of what services you can provide without going to a private provider. Because if you don't have that really solid offer of FAPE, I think they can ask for that. And then you're in a very tough position. What do you guys think, Jennifer, Kendra?
I haven't advised anyone to agree to it yet, but I'm not precluding the case wouldn't walk through the door. Because I think there is a comparison to the non-disabled peers, and if non-disabled peers need their parents' help and they're just so they're asking for a private provider to do the same thing the non-disabled peers' parents are doing, I definitely would not go down that road, because the claims will be endless. And I'm even trying to go down, I guess what I would say to you, exactly what you said about don't let that private provider become a crutch and you start writing things in for them to do. Then I think we're cooked, even if that would be a good idea in a practical sense. Once we start, relying on them, then I think you might as well get out the checkbook for them. And maybe, I mean, like I said, in some situations, maybe that's an okay solution, but it is a slippery slope. For the most part, I'm just trying to punt, or, in-person is around the corner for a lot of people, or even my districts that were not in-person before are starting, that ball is rolling now. I'm getting some of the same questions we got in August, because there's kind of a new wave of schools going back in person. So with that around the corner, you can kind of finesse another month or whatever it is to get to there.
Or look at like the co-op or a therapy. I would look at probably a co-op program or a therapeutic day program. If the district wasn't in person before, I would start looking at, let's get this person because then you start to get these, and no disrespect to the private providers, but the whole point is you're trying to send the kid to school, right? Not provide, therapy. It's supposed to be school still. School, just the idea of, school and participation, that has value. And once you start sort of dismantling that into a home program, I think that's a problem.
Yeah, and I think a lot of districts too, as we're moving towards more, being in person, kind of an intermediate step is having an open space where kids can go and be supervised at school for remote learning. And that can provide that, the prompting and the supervision and some of that some of the kids need, that is helpful. And so I think, doing that problem solving and looking at what progress is the student making, because, each case, it's going to be, we find a solution now, either through the district or the co-op or some creative solution, or down the road, there may be a comp ed claim that we're facing.
Well, and I guess I want to clarify too, because I have recommended deals where we pay for private providers. We have but it's just hard to tease out the COVID. But I don't think of those as COVID cases. We have all the same normal disputes going on where, parents just dissatisfied with the district service. And sometimes it's frankly both less expensive and less aggravating to just go ahead and reimburse the private provider. So I'm doing that in the regular course. I'm just saying for that babysitter type of support because of COVID, I'm a little nervous about those.
So Jennifer, you mentioned earlier residential placements, and so can you tell us a little bit about that issue?
Yeah, I guess I'm just seeing now this time of year, I would always see a spike, I guess, because, you know, they're getting second semester grades. Some parents are going to be upset about that. Maybe the parties over the holidays or it seems like we're kind of in peak, it's far enough into the school year. We're seeing some real misbehavior from some of our high school kids, the drugs, the running away, the suicidal involved issues. So I think that normally I would see an uptick, but I am seeing a huge uptick, and especially of just unilateral placements. I'm seeing more insurance placements where I think that insurers are maybe approving the temporary residential type stays that aren't wilderness, but they're sort of medical boarding schools. I'll describe them. They're not approved ISB schools. You still have to move them. So I just have more of those cases right now than I can remember having in a long time. And I think they're just really hard right now because it's all the facts are out of your control. The observers of this child, for now we're all the way into almost a year that you haven't laid eyes, on the student or anyone that is really your employee. So, when the parent describes certain things, which sometimes I've done this long enough, I take pretty skeptically as far as what they're describing and how not age appropriate it is or isn't. You'll get some parents who their child has a sip of alcohol, they're ready to send them, to wilderness. And you'll have other parents who, they have to be bloodied by their child, with the blood dripping off the knife before they'll call anyone for help. So it's really such a wide, I always think it would be very interesting to get all these parents in a room and have them kind of trade stories, because these are so because all their kids are seeing each other when they get there. That's what I always think is kind of funny in my head. I know all these different kids who are all meeting up at these kind of frequently known residential schools. Anyway, so I'm just seeing a lot of it. What about you guys?
Same. I think the problem is that, first of all, I think this whole experience has been just a reinforcement that school is going to school every day is so important. And if you even think about it from a personal perspective, that is a place that you go and your mother is not there and you can just be who you are in a different way than you are in your family. And psychologically, that has a huge impact on people, especially teenagers, right? So I think normally when we have a residential case, you have the school staff that sees the kid and, sometimes sees the best of the kid or the worst of the kid, but still it's a different perspective. And now all we have is the parent perspective. And that is important, but it can also be skewed because it's not, it's not across settings. You're not seeing the kid with peers. You're not so it's hard to make decisions. You are sort of between a rock and a hard place. If some parent says, my kid is just suicidal, won't get out of bed, won't do this, won't do that, but you haven't seen them except for, 3 40-minute intervals on Zoom. And when you see them, the teacher is looking at, 20 other kids at the screen too, or their screens are off. We talked about this, some districts, because it's just so upsetting to look at we all think it's upsetting, but we move on. To look at yourself, they let the kids have the screen off, and then you really don't know what's going on. We had a related question about one of the questions in the Q&A was about when an agency places a student and it's in a placement, what is the school district's obligation? So I don't know if you guys want to, Kendra, sort of tackle that. And I can't really tell from the question whether it was the parents placing them or the agency placing them. But if it's an agency or the court.
Yeah, I thought it was an FSP, the new ICG.
Okay.
Right.
I thought that was the question. And, you know, those almost stopped for a while, but now I know several of those placements. So I think the question was it's non-approved, but I think when,
I don't think
It's-
it matters.
no, I don't think it does when the
Yeah.
but when they pay the residential piece. I guess I would want to make sure that we understood a little bit more about the facts before giving a definite answer, but
Right.
Yeah.
But generally, if the student is placed, I mean, if it's a family services plan, that's going to fund the placement. But if they're placed by a court, then you're
Well, the
more, you're paying part of that. So you need to just recognize that if it's a placement through, you know, DCFS or the court or something, you might be on the hook for some of that. And that's just how it is.
no, and I think they changed that a few years ago to clarify that you definitely are on the hook when a court makes the placement.
Right, right.
So.
Dana, you were just mentioning some of the difficulties and challenges for, you know, observing kids through remote learning. So we also had some questions about child fines. So Kendra, do you want to tell us what's the latest and greatest with respect to those kinds of challenges right now?
Sure. So like with everything else, we still have our child find obligation. And, you know, right now when we don't have eyes on kids in the same way, it's much more difficult to see, you know, where are kids struggling, to get that really good feedback and progress data, to be able to see where kids have gaps, where they're progressing or where they're not. You know, in talking about kids having their cameras off and being on mute, you know, I can't imagine being a teacher or a social worker, you know, just facing a blank computer screen and trying to teach, you know, how difficult that has to be. And then it's really hard to know, you know, what are the kids learning, what are they not learning, which kids need help. And so I think it's hard to do. We've got to do our best to get data and figure out when kids should be referred. A lot of that is going to happen when kids are in school again in person more frequently. And then I think we're going to have the question come up, okay, so the student's behind in reading or in math, or their behaviors have escalated. Is that due to a disability, or is that due to a struggle with remote learning? Is it due to missed instruction? Is it due, you know, where is that coming from? And should we be finding kids like that eligible? Do we need to take more time? And, you know, kind of how do we piece that puzzle together? Jackie, I think there was a question during registration, if you want to share that with us.
Yeah, so we received this question during registration. I've been receiving several Ames web graphs from teachers that suggest students who are involved in intensive academic interventions are not making educational progress. The interventions that we are giving are half as intense. Are these kids special education, SLD? Can we qualify someone for special ed when we're not doing programs with fidelity based on lack of progress?
Yeah, and I think especially for those SLD determinations, it gets really tricky because we are supposed to be using RTI that's implemented with fidelity. And when we're looking at that data, if we're not seeing the progress, how is the team going to determine, is that student not progressing because they have a learning disability, or because the program wasn't implemented with fidelity, or because the student was only participating some days, or, you know, whatever the barrier was to that consistent implementation. And so I think those are going to be hard decisions for teams. There's not really a black or white answer. RTI is one piece of your evaluation puzzle, right? We're not going to rely on any one piece of data. We're going to have multiple sources. So hopefully you've got data from before the pandemic, some assessments that give you other pieces to that puzzle to try to figure out whether this is a student who we should think maybe this is a disability versus it's something else related to the pandemic. I think the critical piece is for the kids where you say, you know, we think this is due to a lack of instruction or due to the stresses of the pandemic as opposed to a learning disability, making sure that that is really clearly communicated to the parent, that this doesn't close the book forever. And that if your student is struggling, we have the following general education interventions that are going to be put in place. And this is how progress monitoring is going to work. And if after X amount of time, we're not seeing that progress, we're going to come back to the table and we're going to reevaluate. So parents don't feel kind of like they were just left out to dry and their student is really struggling. Making sure you have that gen ed plan in place that parents understand. You
Yeah,
guys
I'm
have
seeing a
other
little
thoughts?
bit of
Yeah.
a trend of jumping to 504s before, almost as an RTI kind of thing, instead of going to IEPs.
Mm.
And I would really discourage that. If the needs are presenting are severe, so like multiple hospitalizations or severe reading problems or whatever, 504 is not a stop on the way to an IEP. It's, you know, kind of two different things. If the needs are presenting as severe, go straight to the case study.
Right. I completely agree with that. And I also think when you have, I mean, just going back to our initial question, if the RTI isn't being done with fidelity, you need to problem solve around that. Why? Is that on the school district's end because of a scheduling glitch, or is that because the student is not participating? And again, if you're not getting engagement, even in this time, you know, there's some risk of liability that you're not, you know, doing child find. So if you're not getting engagement, you need to reach out and document that you're reaching out and trying to address that problem.
So we did get one additional question during registration that I'd like to get to if we can before we wrap up. So the question was, if a special education kindergarten student is not completing remote learning, do we need any additional data to retain them? We also don't have data to know if they're making progress on their goals. Anyone have thoughts on that?
They are not enrolled. Oh, go ahead. So they're not your student at that point. I mean, you've offered a FAPE. Presumably, it sounds like there's an IEP that was offered. The student has, or the family has declined to enroll. I guess there's a difference if they're enrolled and not showing up to remote versus they've withdrawn. They're homeschooling, or
Right.
they've decided not to start schooling. Those would be two different questions. Dana or Kendra, I know you had some thoughts.
Yeah, I think you've got to kind of dig into why are they not completing? Is it because parents have just decided we're not going to do this and we are, you know, homeschooling or just not doing school? Or is that they want to participate, but there's some sort of barrier that we need to be problem solving around? I think the risk of retaining a special education student ever is that really gives the parent ammunition to say, well, if you had to retain the student, you obviously weren't providing them appropriate services, right? So you want to really think carefully about that piece.
And this might be related. I don't know if districts have seen this, and I don't know that I've necessarily, but just parents deciding when kindergarten just to redshirt these kids. You know, like it's just not, if their birthday is at a certain time of the year, or maybe even not, they're just making the decision, we'll try next year. And I think that's different. So I do think, you know, you need to sort of dig down into why they're not coming.
All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists. This was great, as always. Please do keep an eye out for next week's announcement. We're going to be talking about labor issues, which I know there are many. So hopefully you'll join us for that. And in the meantime, take care. Thank you, everyone.
Bye,
Thanks.
everybody.